I lived next door to a guy named Mark, an Army veteran. He was the quiet type, always busy working on his truck or fixing up his yard. We'd wave at each other when we saw one another, but that was it. I didn't know much about him besides his military background. Everything changed one Saturday morning when I bumped into him as I was getting ready to go hiking. He mentioned he was planning to hike the same trail and asked if I wanted to tag along. It felt rude to say no, and honestly, I thought it might be nice to have someone who knew the outdoors with me. The trail was about an hour's drive away, winding through thick woods and climbing up into some hills. We drove separately but met up in the parking lot and started the hike together. Mark wasn't much of a talker, which was fine by me. We hiked in silence for about an hour, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional bird. The trail was steep and rocky, and the forest around us got denser the higher we went. At one point, Mark stopped suddenly and stared at the trees. His face turned serious. He pointed out a small, almost hidden path that split off from the main trail. I hadn't noticed it at all. He said it looked like a deer trail, but the way he was looking at it made me uneasy. It wasn't just a look of curiosity. It was like he was trying to figure out if something was watching us. We kept walking, but Mark seemed different after that. He was more on edge, scanning the trees, stopping more often to listen. I felt it too, this tension building up. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig, made me jumpy. It didn't feel like just birds or squirrels anymore. After another hour or so, we reached the top of the hill, where the trees opened up to a rocky area with a clear view of the valley below. Mark didn't even look at the view. He kept his eyes on the forest behind us, standing with his back to the edge like he was guarding something. I tried to relax, but it was hard with him so on edge. We didn't stay long at the top. Mark started heading back down at a faster pace, barely stopping to catch his breath. I followed, my nerves wound tight. The forest felt different now, darker, quieter. The sounds of wildlife had faded, leaving an eerie silence behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, following us. When we got back to that hidden trail, Mark suddenly stopped and turned to face it. Without a word, he stepped off the main trail and started down the narrow, overgrown path. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay on the main trail, but I followed him. The deeper we went, the more my unease turned into real fear. This wasn't a deer trail. The ground was packed down, the trees spaced out too evenly like people had been using it recently. After about 10 minutes of pushing through the thick bushes, we came into a small clearing. In the middle was a campsite, a beaten-up tent that looked like it had been there for years, surrounded by some rusty cans and a pile of old ashes from a fire. Mark froze, staring at the campsite with a look that sent chills down my spine. He knelt down and picked up one of the cans, turning it over in his hands before dropping it like it burned him. It wasn't old. It was fresh, the label still clear, and the ashes in the fire pit had been messed with recently. Mark stood up quickly, his eyes darting around the trees. Without warning, he took off back the way we came, not saying a word. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the trees leaning in, the shadows growing longer. Every step felt like we were being chased, like something was right behind us, just out of sight. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main trail, gasping for breath. Mark didn't slow down until we were almost at the parking lot. Even then, he kept glancing back, his face pale and tight. When we finally got to our cars, Mark didn't say anything. He just got into his truck and sped off, leaving me standing there, confused and rattled. I didn't stick around either. As I drove home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the hike in my mind, trying to figure out what had happened. The next day, I noticed Mark's truck wasn't in his driveway. A few days passed, and it still wasn't there. A week went by, then two, and still no sign of him. One day, I saw a moving truck in front of his house. By the time I got home from work, Mark's house was empty, with a for sale sign out front. I never saw him again. I never found out what we had stumbled across in those woods. But every time I hike that trail, I make sure to stay far away from that hidden path because whatever was out there, whatever scared an army vet like Mark so much, it's still out there waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about that day. I wonder if Mark was running from something that didn't want to be found. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it knows I saw it too. Maybe that's why, whenever I'm home alone, I get this strange feeling, like I'm not really alone at all. My sister and I had always loved hiking together. We'd been doing it for years, picking different trails every time, always looking for new places to explore. This time, we chose a path that wasn't very popular, hidden away in a quiet part of the mountains. It wasn't on any of the usual hiking sites, which made it perfect for us. We wanted to get away from the usual crowds and enjoy some peace in the wild. The trail started off easy, winding through thick woods with the sun shining through the trees. We laughed and chatted as we walked, enjoying the cool mountain air and the sound of birds around us. The forest was alive with the noises of nature, but the further we went, the quieter it got. After a few hours, the path started to get steeper and more covered in bushes. We had to push through thick plants, and sometimes the trail almost disappeared under our feet. We didn't worry about it, though. We'd been on harder hikes before, and we were sure we could handle it. But as the hours went by, the mood started to change. The woods seemed darker, even though it was still daytime. The trees were so close together that it felt like they were closing in on us. The usual forest sounds were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made my skin crawl. My sister and I kept moving, but we weren't talking or laughing anymore. We just focused on the trail, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was off. We came to a small open area and decided to take a break. The silence was overwhelming, so we didn't stay long. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks anywhere. Usually, you'd see signs of deer, rabbits, or even bears in a place like this, but the ground was untouched, like nothing had lived here for a long time. We kept going, but the trail got more dangerous. The ground was uneven and slippery, and we had to use our hands to keep from falling. It wasn't just the physical effort that was getting to us, though. The air felt thick, almost like it was weighing us down, and I could feel the tension between us. Something was wrong, but neither of us wanted to admit it. As we climbed higher, I started to feel like we were being watched. It wasn't a logical thought, just a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us, but there was nothing, just the same thick forest stretching out in every direction. We finally reached the top of a hill, hoping to see the area around us and figure out where we were. But when we looked out, all we saw was more forest. It was just a sea of trees, with no sign of the trail or anything that would help us find our way. It was like we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. That's when I realized how lost we were. The trail had been hard to follow, and we'd made so many twists and turns that I had no idea which way we had come from. My sister must have realized it too, because she gave me a look that showed she was just as scared as I was. We decided to try and go back the way we came, hoping to find something familiar. But as we started walking, everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, even the patches of bushes, they all blended together in a confusing pattern. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us, pulling us deeper into its heart. Hours went by, and the sun began to set. The light was fading fast, and the temperature was dropping. We didn't have the gear to spend the night out here, and the thought of being stuck in these woods after dark was terrifying. We started walking faster, desperately trying to find our way out. Just when it felt like we were making progress, I noticed something up ahead. Our backpacks, lying on the ground in the same clearing where we'd stopped earlier. We had walked in a circle. Panic hit us hard as we realized that we were trapped in this forest, unable to find our way out. The shadows grew longer, and the air turned freezing cold. My sister and I huddled together, knowing we had no choice but to keep moving, even as the darkness closed in around us. We walked through the night, exhausted and scared out of our minds. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch sent waves of fear through us. But it wasn't until early the next morning that we saw something that made my blood run cold. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we came across another clearing. In the middle of it, there was a pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. They were too neatly stacked to be natural, and something about them felt wrong, almost threatening. What sent a chill down my spine was the realization that we hadn't seen this clearing before. It wasn't just that we were lost. It was like the forest itself was changing, leading us in circles, and now showing us this disturbing sight. My sister and I exchanged a glance, our fear now clear as day. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just us getting lost. The forest didn't want us to leave. We were caught in a place that was playing with us, twisting the paths, shifting the landscape. And I knew, deep down, that the longer we stayed, the harder it would be to ever find our way out. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to our hike. It was alive, and it was toying with us, trapping us in its depths, with no way out. The thought settled in my mind like a heavy weight, chilling me to the bone. We might never make it out. I was excited for my solo hike through the old forest near my grandmother's house. It was a quiet, hidden spot that I'd walked many times before, but today felt different. The woods were eerily still, as if they were holding their breath. As I walked the usual trail, I noticed the thick bushes seemed even denser than usual, making it hard to see far ahead. About an hour into my hike, I came across something strange. A small, carefully arranged pile of stones and sticks right in the middle of the path. It felt out of place, almost like it was intentionally set there. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be a prank or the work of another hiker, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept looking around, and the forest seemed to close in on me, with shadows moving just out of sight. It felt as if the trees themselves were watching me. After another hour, I decided it was time to head back. I was starting to feel anxious, and the once familiar trail now felt like a confusing maze. As I turned around, I saw the same pile of stones and sticks on the path again. It looked like it had been moved from where I had first seen it. My heart pounded. I knew I hadn't passed it twice. I picked up the pace, my breathing quick and shallow. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. It wasn't just the forest that was making me nervous. It was the thought that someone, or something, might be following me. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I felt a wave of relief seeing the open field of my grandmother's property. I had just started to calm down when I noticed a figure on the porch, an old woman with a familiar face. It was my grandmother watching me intently. I walked up to her, shaking, and she asked about the hike. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just nodded, looking at me strangely. Later that night, while we were preparing dinner, she casually mentioned that she'd heard about someone trying to build a small shelter in the woods recently. She said it was probably just a local with odd habits, but it didn't sound like something to worry about. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I kept the lights on and checked all the doors and windows several times. The calm of the evening felt like it could shatter at any moment. When I got back to the city and looked through my phone's gallery, I found a photo I'd taken by accident during the hike. In the background, slightly blurry, was a figure standing behind a tree. I hadn't seen it while taking the photo, and it was hard to make out details, but the presence was clear. The next time I hiked there, I stayed on the main paths and avoided the area where I'd seen the stones. I kept a watchful eye, but I never saw the figure again. However, the unsettling memory of that day never left me. The forest remained a place of quiet terror. Each time I passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make its presence known again. The thought that I might not have been alone all along was the most chilling of all. I was hiking alone in an area that a friend had once told me about. The trail wasn't marked clearly, but I had a map and a GPS, so I felt pretty sure I could handle it. The place was mostly untouched, with thick forests and a few open fields here and there. The weather was perfect, and the fresh air felt great. As the sun started to go down, I decided it was time to find a place to set up camp. I found a small clearing that looked just right: flat ground, trees to block the wind, and a small stream nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and made a small fire to cook my dinner. Everything felt calm, and I was looking forward to a quiet night under the stars. After eating, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt a sense of peace, knowing I was miles away from anyone else, deep in the woods. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what woke me up at first, but then I noticed something strange. The air felt thick, and there was a strange smell, like wet dirt mixed with something metallic. My first thought was that it was just the forest, maybe some animal nearby, but the smell was stronger than anything I'd ever come across before. It was making me feel uneasy. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. A faint, steady sound, like footsteps, but slower and more careful. I stayed still, listening closely. The sound seemed to be coming from outside my tent, moving around it slowly. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy for that. My heart started to pound, and I could feel my hands sweating. I waited, trying not to make any noise, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But the footsteps kept circling, slow and steady, getting closer to my tent. The smell was stronger now, almost making me feel sick. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, every part of me screaming that something was very wrong. Then the sound stopped right outside the tent. I could feel something there, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly. The silence was crushing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of something being dragged across the ground, like something heavy being pulled away from the tent. I stayed in my tent, frozen with fear, until the first light of dawn. When I finally forced myself to step outside, the clearing was quiet, the smell was gone, and everything looked normal except for one thing. About 20 feet from my tent, the ground was messed up, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt and leaves. The trail led into the forest, disappearing into the thick bushes. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not caring about breakfast or even the fire. I just wanted to get out of there. As I rushed down the trail, I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following me. The forest was strangely quiet, like it was hiding something. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my heart still racing. I never figured out what was out there that night, but whatever it was real. There was no trick of the mind, no imagining things. I've hiked in many remote places since then, but I've never gone back to that trail. Some places are better left alone. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close. I decided to go on a solo hike along a trail I'd never tried before. The weather was perfect, and the trail was known to be tough but with great views. I packed light, just some water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. The trail started off easy, winding through thick trees and clearings where I could see the mountains in the distance. As I kept going, the path got steeper, and the trees grew closer together. The trail markers that had been easy to spot earlier started getting harder to find, but I felt sure I could keep track of where I was going. After about an hour, I reached a split in the trail. There were no signs to show which way to go. One path looked well worn, while the other was barely visible, covered in bushes and weeds. I chose the overgrown path, thinking it might be a shortcut. The trail quickly got rough. Tree roots and rocks stuck out, making it hard to walk without tripping. I had to push through thick bushes that scratched at my arms and legs. I noticed that it was getting harder to see the sky through the trees, and everything around me felt darker. The air seemed different too, heavier, and I realized that I hadn't heard any birds or seen any animals for a while. It was as if the forest had gone completely silent. After what seemed like another hour, I started to worry that I had made a mistake. The trail had disappeared, swallowed up by the forest. I looked around and realized I couldn't recognize anything. My sense of direction was totally messed up, and panic began to set in. I decided to turn back, but after walking for a few minutes, nothing looked familiar. It was as if the trees had moved, twisting the landscape into something I couldn't recognize. I tried to stay calm, but I was starting to sweat even though the air was cool. I began walking faster, hoping to find the main trail again, but it only felt like I was getting deeper into the woods. The sun was going down, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even stranger. Suddenly, I stumbled into a small clearing with something odd in the middle. It was an old, rotting cabin, barely standing, hidden deep in the woods. The wood was falling apart, and the roof had partially collapsed. I didn't want to go near it, but it felt like a sign, a marker that I wasn't the first person to get lost out here. I decided to take a break and think about what to do next. I sat on a fallen log near the cabin, trying to figure out which way to go. That's when I noticed something strange. There were several small mounds in the ground nearby. They were too neat to be natural, more like unmarked graves. My heart started pounding as I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it, something shiny sticking out of the dirt near one of the mounds. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to it. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt to reveal an old, rusted hunting knife. The handle was worn and the blade was dull, but it looked like someone had put it there on purpose. That's when it hit me. This place, this cabin, wasn't just some forgotten building. Someone had been here before, and they had left this knife behind, either as a warning or because they didn't make it out. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't just lost. I was in a place where people vanished, a place where the forest swallowed them whole. I forced myself to get up and start moving again, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. I walked as quickly as I could, not caring about the direction anymore, just trying to get away from that clearing. The light was fading fast, and the forest grew darker with every step. Hours went by, and the panic in my chest was turning into pure exhaustion. I had no idea where I was, and the night was closing in. My legs felt like lead, and I stumbled often, but I kept pushing forward. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw a faint light ahead. Hope surged through me, and I pushed forward, crashing through the bushes until I burst out onto the main trail. I was back on the trail, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew I wasn't safe yet. I forced myself to keep walking, following the trail as it wound down the mountain. I didn't stop until I saw the parking lot, my car sitting there in the dim light. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, still waiting for me to make one wrong move. I had escaped, but just barely. The memory of that cabin, those mounds, and the knife buried in the dirt haunted me. I knew that whatever had happened there, I had come too close to becoming just another part of the woods, swallowed up by the silence that hid something far worse than I could ever explain. And now, even though I'm far away from those woods, I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I step into any forest, I feel that same heavy silence, as if it's waiting for me to let my guard down. I know deep down that one wrong step, and I might never come out again. The forest doesn't forget, and it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. I'd been on a lot of patrols, but this one felt different. We got a call about a hiker who'd been missing for 3 days. I was part of the search team, and our job was to hike deep into the woods to find him. The trail was rough, and the farther we went, the thicker the trees became. The woods were so dense that it felt like they were swallowing up the sunlight. It was eerily quiet, with only the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes breaking the silence. Every time I tried to listen, though, everything would go quiet again. After hours of hiking, I came across a narrow, old path that looked unused for years. It felt off, but I decided to follow it, hoping it might lead us to the missing hiker. The path brought me to a clearing with an old, run-down cabin. The place seemed deserted, with weeds growing all around and the roof sagging. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight inside. The cabin was empty, but I noticed a few things. A pair of hiking boots near the door, a torn backpack, and a crumpled map on the table. I picked up the map and saw it had several spots marked, one very close to where we were. I decided to check the area around the cabin. When I stepped outside, I noticed something troubling. Fresh footprints leading away from the cabin, but they were uneven, like someone had been stumbling or dragging their feet. I followed the tracks until they suddenly stopped at the edge of a steep ravine. I shined my light down into the dark chasm, but I couldn't see much. The ground around the edge was disturbed, as if something had been dragged or thrown down there. My heart raced, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I thought about what might have happened. I reported what I'd found and waited for the rest of the team to arrive. When they showed up, we carefully searched the area. It didn't take long for one of the team members to spot something further down the ravine, an area that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Using ropes, we made our way down and found the missing hiker trapped between some rocks. It was clear he had either fallen or been thrown, and the signs showed he didn't survive long after the fall. The torn backpack and map were his, and they showed he had tried to find his way out but couldn't. As the sun set, we gathered our gear and prepared to leave. The woods seemed darker and more oppressive now, and the silence felt heavier. It was a grim reminder of how harsh and dangerous the wilderness can be. We had found the missing hiker, but the forest had claimed its price. Back at the station, the reality of the situation hit me hard. It was a chilling reminder that even familiar places can hide deadly dangers. No matter how careful you are, sometimes the wild has its own way of taking what it wants. As I reviewed the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister out there, lurking in the shadows of the woods, waiting for its next chance. I decided to go hiking with my father-in-law one weekend. He was always on the move and loved talking about the hikes he used to take when he was younger. I thought it would be a good way to bond and maybe impress him a bit. We picked a trail deep in the mountains, known for its tough terrain and stunning views. The trail started off easy, with wide paths and a gentle slope. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was fresh. We walked in silence, our boots crunching on the gravel. As we went deeper into the mountains, the path narrowed, and the trees got thicker. The sunlight turned into just a few rays peeking through the trees. The air got colder, and the silence around us felt heavier. After a few hours, the trail began to climb steeply. The trees became fewer, and the ground was rocky, making each step feel unstable. We kept going, but I could feel the strain in my legs. My father-in-law, despite being older, handled it with ease, hardly slowing down. I pushed myself to keep up, not wanting to seem weak. Eventually, the trail led us to a ridge with a steep drop on one side. The path was barely wide enough for one person to walk comfortably. Below, the valley stretched out, looking tiny and far away. The wind picked up, making it harder to keep my balance. I focused on each step, trying not to slip. As we walked along the ridge, I noticed the ground felt loose. Small rocks kept sliding down the slope with each step. It made me nervous, but I stayed quiet. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, trying to keep up with my father-in-law. The ridge seemed endless, with each step making the drop below feel more menacing. Suddenly, I heard a sound like something shifting under my feet. I froze, feeling the ground give way. A section of the trail crumbled and fell away, taking my footing with it. I dropped to my hands and knees, gripping the dirt with my fingers. My heart pounded as I realized how close I was to falling off the edge. I managed to pull myself back onto the narrow path, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. My father-in-law was a few steps ahead, unaware of what had just happened. I got back on my feet, forcing myself to keep moving, but each step felt like a gamble now. The ridge continued, and so did the loose ground beneath us. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trail started to widen again. The ridge dropped away, and we were back on more solid ground. The relief I felt was intense, but it didn't last long. I looked back at the ridge we had just crossed, realizing how narrow and dangerous it really was. The thought of how close I had come to a serious fall was chilling. As we made our way down the mountain, the reality of what could have happened weighed heavily on me. My father-in-law walked ahead, seemingly unaffected, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had pushed myself too far. I understood then that nature doesn't care how ready or determined you are. One wrong step, one moment of bad luck, and it could all end in an instant. By late afternoon, we reached the bottom of the trail. I looked back at the mountain, the ridge now just a thin line in the distance. I didn't say anything, but the experience had a lasting impact. I learned that the mountains are not just beautiful but also perilous, and no amount of confidence or experience can protect you from their dangers. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind kept replaying the moment when the ground gave way beneath me. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to slipping off that ridge. I wondered how easily it could have been my last hike. The thought that my life could have ended in such a brutal way, falling into that abyss, kept me awake. The next morning, the weight of that near-death experience still hung over me, and I knew it was something that would haunt me for a long time.